The T-54 and T-55 tanks are a series of Soviet main battle tanks introduced just as the Second World War ended. The first T-54 prototype appeared in March 1945 and entered full production in 1947. It became the main tank for armored units of the Soviet Army, armies of the Warsaw Pact countries, and many others. T-54s and T-55s were involved in many of the world's armed conflicts during the late 20th century. The T-54 55th series eventually became one of the most produced tanks in military history. Estimated production numbers for the series range from 86,000 to 100,000. They were replaced by the T-62, T-64, T-72, T-80, and T-90 in the Soviet and Russian armies, but remain in use by up to 50 other armies worldwide, some having received sophisticated retrofitting. During the Cold War, Soviet tanks never directly faced the NATO adversaries in Europe. However, the T-54 55's first appearance in the West in the 1950s spurred the United Kingdom to develop a new tank gun, the Royal Ordnance L7, and the United States to develop the M60 Patton. Development history. Predecessors: T-34 and T-44. The Soviet T-34 medium tank of the 1940s is considered to have the best balance of firepower, protection and mobility for its cost of any tank of its time in the world. Its development never stopped throughout the Second World War and it continued to perform well. However, the designers could not incorporate the latest technologies or major developments as vital tank production could not be interrupted during wartime. In 1943, the Morozov Design Bureau resurrected the pre-war T-34M development project and created the T-44 tank. Thanks to a space-efficient torsion bar suspension, a novel transverse engine mount, and the removal of the hull machine gunner's crew position, the T-44 had cross-country performance at least as good as the T-34, but with substantially superior armor and a much more powerful 85mm gun. By the time the T-44 was ready for production, the T-34 had also been modified to fit the same gun. Although the T-44 was superior in most other ways, by this time T-34 production was in full swing and the massive numbers of T-34s being built offset any advantage to smaller numbers of a superior design. The T-44 was produced in only small numbers, around 2,000 being completed during the war. Instead, the designers continued to use the design as the basis for further improved guns, experimenting with the 122mm design, but later deciding a 100mm gun was a better alternative. Prototypes' efforts to fit the 100mm gun to the T-44 demonstrated that small changes to the design would greatly improve the combination. The main issue was a larger turret ring, which suggested slightly enlarging the hull. A prototype of the new design, about 40 cm longer and only 10 cm wider, was completed in 1945. This model looked almost identical to the original T-44, albeit with a much larger gun. In testing, there were numerous drawbacks that required correction and many alterations that had to be made to the vehicle's design. It was decided to begin serial production of the new vehicle and the vehicle officially entered service on the 29th of April 1946. It would go into production in Nizhny Tagil in 1947 and Kharkov in 1948. T-54 production of the initial series of T-54s began slowly as 1,490 modifications were made. The Red Army received a tank that was superior to World War II designs and theoretically better than the newest tanks of potential opponents. The 100mm gun-fired BR-412 series full-caliber APHE ammunition, which had superior penetration ammunition capability when compared to the T-34 that it replaced. The serial production version, designated T-54-1, differed from the second T-54 prototype. It had thicker hull armor. As production ramped up, quality problems emerged. Production was stopped and an improved T-54-2 version was designed. Several changes were made and a new turret was fitted. The new dome-shaped turret with flat sides was inspired by the turret from the IS-3 heavy tank. It is similar to the later T-54 turret but with a distinctive overhang at the rear. It also had a shorter muzzle. The fender machine guns were removed in favor of a single bow-mounted machine gun. The transmission was modernized and the track was widened to 580 mm. The T-54-2 entered production in 1949 at Stalin Ural Tank Factory No. 183. In 1951, a second modernization was made, designated T-54-3, which had a new turret with outside undercuts, as well as the new TSH-2-22 telescopic gunner's sight instead of the TSH-20. The tank featured the TDA smoke-generating system. A command version was built, the T-54K, with a second R-113 radio. T-54A and T-54B. In the beginning of the 1950s, the personnel of the OKB 520 Design Bureau of the Stalin Ural Tank Factory No. 183 had been changed considerably. Morozov was replaced by Kolzanov, who in turn was replaced by Leonid N. Kartsev in March 1953. The first decision of the new designer was to fit the 100 mm D-10T tank gun with the SDP-1 Gorizont vertical stabilizer. The new tank gun received the designation D-10TG and was fitted into the T-54's turret. The new tank received night vision equipment for the driver and was designated T-54A. Originally, this had a small muzzle counterweight which was later replaced with a fume extractor. It was equipped with an OPVT wading snorkel, the TSH-2A22 telescopic sight, TVN-1 infrared driver's periscope, an IR headlight, a new R-113 radio, multi-stage engined air filter and radiator controls for improved engine performance, an electrical oil pump, a bilge pump, an automatic fire extinguisher and extra fuel tanks. The tank officially entered production in 1954 and service in 1955. It served as a basis for T-54AK command tank, with additional R-112 radio set, TNA-2 navigational device, ammunition load for the main gun decreased by 5 rounds and the AB-1P-30 charging unit, which was produced in small numbers. In October 1954, a T-54A tank, designated as T-54M, served as a testbed for new D-540 and D-540S 100 mm smoothbore guns and Jaguar and Molniya stabilization systems, which were later used in the T-62. These were not completely successful, so further T-55 development continued to use the D-10 series guns. It was fitted with V-54-6 engine developing 581 horsepower. It never went into production. A new version, based on T-54A, designated T-54B, was designed in 1955. It was fitted with a new 100 mm D-10T2S tank gun with SDP-2 Cyclone 2-plane stabilizer. It entered production in 1957. During the last 4 months of production, the new tanks were equipped with an L2 lunar infrared searchlight, a TPN-12211 IR gunner's sight, and an OU-3 IR commander's searchlight. Modern APF SDS ammunition was developed. dramatically enhancing the penetrative performance of the gun to keep it competitive with NATO armor developments. T-54B served as the basis for T-54BK command tank, which had exactly the same additional equipment as the T-54AK command tank. T-55 trials with nuclear weapons showed that a T-54 could survive a 2 to 15 knots nuclear charge at a range of more than 300 meters from the epicenter, but the crew only had a chance of surviving at 700 meters. It was decided to create an Nbc Protection system which would start working 0.3 seconds after detecting gamma radiation. The task of creating a basic PAS Nbc Protection system offering protection against the blast of a nuclear explosion and particulate filtration, but not against external gamma radiation gas, was given to the KB-60 Design Bureau in Kharkov and was completed in 1956. The documentation was sent to Uralvagonzavod. It was decided to increase the tank's battle capabilities by changing the tank's construction and introducing new production technologies. Many of those changes were initially tested on the T-54M. The tank was fitted with the new V55 12-cylinder 4-stroke 1-chamber 38.88-liter water-cooled diesel engine developing 581 horsepower. Greater engine power was accomplished by increasing the pressure of the fuel delivery and charging degree. The designers planned to introduce a heating system for the engine compartment and MC1 diesel fuel filter. The engine was to be started pneumatically with the use of an AK-15OS charger and an electric starter. This eliminated the need for the tank to carry a tank filled with air. To allow easier access during maintenance and repairs, it was decided to change hatches over the engine compartment. To increase the operational range, 300 liters fuel tanks were added to the front of the hull, increasing the overall fuel capacity to 680 liters. The ammunition load for the main gun was increased from 34 to 45, with 18 shells stored in so-called wet containers located in hull fuel tanks. The ammunition load included high explosive fragmentation and anti-tank rounds, and designers also planned to introduce the BK-5M heat rounds, which penetrated 390 mm thick armor. The TPKU commander's vision device was replaced by either the TPKU-B or TPKU-2B. The gunner received a TNP-165 vision device. The loader's hatch-mounted 12.7 mm DSHK anti-aircraft heavy machine gun was dropped because it was deemed worthless against high-performance jets. The tank was supposed to be equipped with the Rosa fire protection system. The tank had a thicker turret casting and the improved two-plane gun stabilization system from the T-54B, as well as night vision fighting equipment. To balance the weight of the new equipment, the armor on the back of the hull was thinned slightly. The T-55 was significantly superior to the IS-2 heavy tank in all respects, including the rate of fire of the gun. Despite somewhat thinner frontal turret armor instead of 250 mm, it compared favorably with the IS-3, thanks to its improved anti-tank gun and better mobility. Heavy tanks soon fell from favor, with only 350 IS-3s produced. The old model of highly mobile medium tanks and heavily armored heavy tanks was replaced by a new paradigm, the main battle tank. Parallel developments in the West would produce similar results. Kartsev combined all the ongoing improvements being offered, or planned, on the T-54 into one design. This became the Object 155, and entered production at Uralvagonzavod the 1st of January 1958 as the T-55. It was accepted for service with the Red Army on the 8th of May. It suffered a significant lapse in one area. There was no anti-aircraft machine gun, which had been present on the T-54. After 1959, it served as a basis for the T-55K command tank, which was equipped with an additional R-112 radio set, an AB-1P-30 fuel-powered accumulator charging unit, and TPN January 22, 11 night vision sight. All this additional equipment made it necessary to decrease the ammunition load for the main gun to 37 rounds and eliminate the bow machine gun. In the beginning of the 1960s, a T-55K was experimentally fitted with a Urim TV relay apparatus for battlefield surveillance. The tank was fitted with an external camera, the picture from which was relayed to a receiver in a BTR-50PU command vehicle. There was an observation camera mounted on a folding mast, which was in turn mounted on a UAZ-69 car. The range within which the picture could be relayed varied between 10 and 30 kilometers. In 1961, a T-55 tank was used to test the armoured TV complex, which was supposed to replace the standard observation devices right after a nuclear explosion or while fording a body of water. There was a camera mounted on the hull for the driver and two cameras mounted on the turret, one for aiming and one for observation, and the picture from the cameras was relayed to two control screens. The tank had the front hull fuel tanks and bow machine gun removed. The commander was seated in the driver's usual position while the driver sat next to him. The cameras allowed battlefield observation and firing during daytime at ranges between 1.5 and 2 kilometers. Because of the low quality of the equipment, the trials gave negative results. In the beginning of the 1960s, the OKB-29 Design Bureau in Omsk was working on adapting the tank to use a GTD-3T gas turbine engine developing 700 horsepower. One T-55 tank fitted with this gas turbine engine passed trials but was deemed unsatisfactory and the design did not go into production. The Omsk OKB-29 group tested 3 experimental T-55 tanks between 1962 and 1965 that were fitted with an automatic gearbox controlled by electro-hydraulic systems. The trials found that such gearboxes were prone to frequent breakdowns in tanks. At the same time, the Object 155 megaliters, a T-55 fitted with a launcher for 3 9M14 Malyatka ATGMs mounted on the rear of the turret, was tested. Along with standard tanks, a flamethrower armed version was designed, which was produced until 1962. It was fitted with 460-liter tanks filled with flammable liquid instead of the frontal hull fuel tanks. The flamethrower replaced the coaxial machine gun. This was a much better way to mount a flamethrower than in the experimental Object 483, based on the T-54 tank, where the flamethrower replaced the main gun. T-55 flamethrower tanks were withdrawn from service in 1993. T-55A in 1961. Development of improved Nbc protection systems began. The goal was to protect the crew from fast neutrons. Adequate protection against gamma radiation was provided by the thick armor and a PAS basic Nbc protection system. The POV plasticized lead anti-radiation lining was developed to provide the needed protection. It was installed in the interior, requiring the driver's hatch and the coamings over the turret hatches to be noticeably enlarged. This liner had the added benefit of protecting the crew from fragments of penetrated armor. The tank was equipped with a full PAS FVU chemical filtration system. The coaxial 7.62 mm SGMT machine gun was replaced by a 7.62 mm PKT machine gun. The hull was lengthened from 6.04 meters to 6.2 meters. The hull machine gun was removed, making space for 6 more main gun rounds. These changes increased the weight of the vehicle to 38 tons. The design work was done by OKB 520 Design Bureau of Uralvagonzavod under the leadership of Leonid N. Kartsev. The T-55A served as the basis for the T-55AK command tank. T-54, T-55 upgrades in its long service life. The T-55 has been upgraded many times. Early T-55s were fitted with a new TSH-2B3 two-piece sight. In 1959, some tanks received mountings for the PT-55 mine-clearing system of the BTU-55 plow. In 1967, the improved BM-8 APDS round, which could penetrate 275 mm thick armor at a range of 2 km, was introduced. In 1970, new and old T-55 tanks had the loader's hatch modified to mount the 12.7 mm DSHK machine gun, to deal with the threat of attack helicopters. Starting in 1974, T-55 tanks received the KTD-1 and KTD-2 laser rangefinder in an armored box over the mantet of the main gun, as well as the R-123 or R-123M radio set. Simultaneously, efforts were made to modernize and increase the lifespan of the drivetrain. During production, the T-55A was frequently modernized. In 1965, a new track was introduced that could be used for between 2,000 km and 3,000 km, which was twice the range of the old track. It required a new drive sprocket with 14 teeth instead of 13. Since 1974, T-55A tanks were equipped with a KTD-1 newer rangefinder and a TSZS-32PM sight. All T-55A tanks were equipped with the TPN January 22, 11 night sight. The R-113 radio set was replaced by a R-123 radio set. Late production models had rubber side skirts and a driver's windshield for use during longer stints. T-54 and T-55 tanks continued to be upgraded, refitted, and modernized into the 1990s. Advances in armor piercing and heat ammunition would improve the gun's anti-tank capabilities in the 1960s and 1980s. A wide array of upgrades in different price ranges are provided by many manufacturers in different countries, intended to bring the T-54 55ths up to the capabilities of newer MBTs at a lower cost. Upgrades include new engines, explosive reactive armor, new main armaments such as 120mm or 125mm guns, active protection systems, and fire control systems with rangefinders or thermal sights. These improvements make it a potent main battle tank for the low-end budget, even to this day. One of these upgrade packages was produced by Cadillac Gage Textron, and a prototype named the Jaguar was produced. The Jaguar looked quite different from its predecessors. A newly designed turret was formed by flat armor plates installed at different angles. The hull top was new. The engine compartment and fuel tanks on the shelves over the tracks were armor protected. The Soviet-made 100mm gun was replaced with the American M68 105mm rifled gun fitted with a thermal sleeve. A Marconi fire control system, which was originally developed for the American light tank Stingray, was fitted. The vehicle incorporated a Cadillac Gage weapon stabilizer and gunner's sight equipped with an integral laser rangefinder. The power pack inherited by the Jaguar from the Stinger underwent only minor alterations and comprised the Detroit Diesel 8V92T engine and XDG 411 automatic transmission. In 1989, 2 Jaguar tanks were manufactured. The chassis were provided by PRC, while the hull tops, turrets and power plants were manufactured by Cadillac Gage Textron. Another prototype upgrade package was produced by Teledyne Continental Motors for the Egyptian Army and was known as the T-54E. After further modifications and trials, it was sent into mass production and received the designation Ramses II. As late as 2013, Ukrainian companies were reportedly developing T-55 main battle tank upgrades targeting the export market. The Type 59 is still in production, in several variants. Description: the T-54 and T-55 have a cabin layout shared with many post-World War II tanks, with the fighting compartment in the front, engine compartment in the rear, and a dome-shaped turret in the center of the hull. The driver's hatch is on the front left of the hull roof. The commander is seated on the left, with the gunner to his front and the loader on the right. The tank's suspension has the drive sprocket at the rear and air track. Engine exhaust is on the left fender. There is a prominent gap between the first and second road wheel pairs, a distinguishing feature from the T-62, which has progressively larger spaces between road wheels towards the rear. The T-54 and T-55 tanks are outwardly very similar and difficult to distinguish visually. Many T-54s were also updated to T-55 standards, so the distinction is often downplayed with the collective name T-54 55ths. Soviet tanks were factory overhauled every 7,000 kilometers and often given minor technology updates. Many states have added or modified the tank's equipment. India, for example, affixed fake fume extractors to its T-54s and T-55s so that its gunners would not confuse them with Pakistani Type 59s. The older T-54 can be distinguished from the T-55 by a dome-shaped ventilator on the front right of the turret and a driver-operated SGMT 7.62 mm machine gun mounted to fire through a tiny hole in the center of the hull's front. Early T-54s lacked a gun fume extractor, had an undercut at the turret's rear, and a distinctive pig snout gun mantlet. Advantages and drawbacks. The T-54 55ths tanks are mechanically simple and robust. They are very simple to operate compared to Western tanks, and don't require a high level of training or education in their crew members. The T-54 55ths is a relatively small main battle tank, presenting a smaller target for its opponents to hit. The tanks have good mobility thanks to the relatively lightweight, wide tracks, a good cold weather start-up system, and a snorkel that allows river crossings. According to Zaloga, by the standards of the 1950s, the T-54 was an excellent tank combining lethal firepower, excellent armor protection and good reliability, while remaining a significantly smaller and lighter tank than its NATO contemporaries, the U.S. M48 Patton and the British Centurion. The 100 mm D-10T tank gun was more powerful than its Western counterparts. This advantage lasted until the T-54 began to be countered by newer Western developments like the M60 main battle tank and upgraded Centurions and M48 Pattons using the 105 mm rifled M68 Royal Ordnance L7 gun, due to the lack of a subcaliber round for the 100 mm gun, and the tank's simple fire control system. The T-54 55ths was forced to rely on heat-shaped charge ammunition to engage tanks at long range well into the 1960s. Despite the relative inaccuracy of this ammunition at long ranges, the Soviets considered this acceptable for a potential European conflict, until the development of composite armor began reducing the effectiveness of heat warheads and sabot rounds were developed for the D-10T gun. Nevertheless, T-54 55th tanks had the drawbacks. Small size is achieved at the expense of interior space and ergonomics, which causes practical difficulties, as it constrains the physical movements of the crew and slows operation of controls and equipment. This is a common trait of most Soviet tanks, and hence height limits were set for certain tank crew positions in the Soviet Army, whereas other armies may not include crew member height limits as standards. The low turret profile of the tanks prevents them from depressing the main guns by more than 5 degrees, since the breech would strike the ceiling when fired, which limits the ability to cover terrain by fire from a hull-down position on a reverse slope. As in most tanks of that generation, the internal ammunition supply is not shielded, increasing the risk that any enemy penetration of the fighting compartment could cause a catastrophic secondary explosion. The T-54 lacks Nbc Protection, a revolving turret floor, and early models lacked gun stabilization. All of these problems were corrected in the otherwise largely identical T-55 tank. Together, the T-54 55th tanks have been manufactured in the tens of thousands, and many still remain in reserve, or even in frontline use among lower technology fighting forces. Abundance and age together make these tanks cheap and easy to purchase, while the T-54 55th is not a match for a modern main battle tank. Armor and ammunition upgrades can dramatically improve the old vehicle's performance to the point that it cannot be dismissed on the battlefield. Production history: USSR T-54-1 production was slow at first, as only 3 vehicles were built in 1946 and 22 in 1947. 285 T-54-1 tanks were built in 1948 by Stalin Ural Tank Factory No. 183. By then it had completely replaced T-44 production at Uralvagonzavod and Kharkov Diesel Factory No. 75. Production was stopped because of a low level of production quality and frequent breakdowns. The T-54-2 entered production in 1949 at Uralvagonzavod, which produced 423 tanks by the end of 1950. It replaced the T-34 in production at the Omsk Factory No. 183 in 1950. In 1951, over 800 T-54-2 tanks were produced. The T-54-2 remained in production until 1952. The T-54A was produced between 1955 and 1957. The T-54B was produced between 1957 and April 1959. The T-55 was produced by Uralvagonzavod between 1958 and 1962. The T-55K command tank was produced from 1959. The T-55 flamethrower tank was produced until 1962. Overall 35,000 T-54-1, T-54-2, T-54, T-54A, T-54B, T-54AK-1, T-54AK-2, T-54BK-1 and T-54BK-2 tanks were produced between 1946 and 1958, and 27,500 T-55, T-55A, T-55K-1, T-55K-2, T-55A-3, T-55AK-1, T-55AK-2 and T-55AK-3 tanks were produced between 1955 and 1981. Poland produced 3,000 T-54, T-54A, T-54AD and T-54 T-54AM tanks between 1956 and 1964 and 7,000 T-55, T-55L, T-55AD1 and T-55AD2 tanks. Czechoslovakia produced 2,700 T-54A, T-54AM, T-54AK, T-54AMK tanks and 8,300 T-55 and T-55A tanks. Most of them were for export.